Hello everyone, my name is Garrett DeHond. I am an assistant professor at Wayday's Department of English Linguistics and Language Technology, and I'm presenting to you today determining text-specific comments in L2 peer response. This is a little study I did a while back trying to get an idea of some different types of definitions on peer response discourse characteristics that I am not really seeing in the literature so much. And it's something that I would like to extend on in the future. You'll see in today's presentation the different ideas and reflections I have on that. And if you can get something out of what you get in peer response activities in your classroom, or if you have interests in this kind of topic and have some suggestions for how I'm defining the response characteristics, I would look forward to it, look forward to your replies, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. So why don't we go ahead and get started. Now, since the 1980s, peer response discourse has been a pretty popular topic in L2 writing studies. A lot of researchers have attempted to derive different types of sociocultural cognitive characteristics from the activity. This also happens in L1 writing literature as well, but it's definitely been a lot more prevalent in the L2 literature from what I've seen. And when researchers do look at peer response discourse characteristics, obviously they're going to be developing different kinds of coding schemes that are either establishing a new or relying on some type of theoretical perspective for what the activity should be like. They're looking at the characteristics in sentential or clausal meaningful idea units. One thing that's worth noting, however, is that most of the dominant, highly cited peer response literature kind of comes out of the 90s period into the early 2000s, as you see in these examples on the right side here. And most, though not all, of that literature is oral communication, maybe sometimes handwritten communication. It's not until the early to mid 2000s that we start seeing a lot more computer technology coming into the research, though at the same time, many of the coding schemes that have been established for those later studies still rely on the studies that I am referencing right here in this slide. One particular study that I like to highlight is this Lewin-Stadler 2003 study, because this has become pretty popular amongst people who have done research later. Lewin-Stadler created a framework for examining area, nature, and type comments. So area is the global or local features. Nature is whether or not the comment was intended to push revision or not. Type comments are things like evaluations, clarifications, suggestions, and alterations. Some studies after Lewin-Stadler came up with some extended categories of their own, but these have been the pretty dominant ones. However, the thing that I think I see missing is some attempt to try to get to text-specific comments, as you see in this bottom item here, specificity. My notion of specificity comes from an article by Ferris in 1997. She was actually examining teacher commentary in that study, not peer commentary. And when looking at teachers' comments on student papers, one of the things that she did was came up with these two definitions here. First of all, she observed generic statements. And in her definition, the writer creates some idea that does respond to the essay text, but it could be easily transported to another essay done in that context, in that class, what have you. And then if it's not generic, it would be text-specific statements if the idea shows an explicit reference to something that appears in the original essay text. So here we have some examples to guide our understanding of what we're talking about as far as generic and text-specific. So the first item here, you have a bad thesis. If we're doing the Lewin-Stadler original framework, then that is global, it's revision oriented, and it's an evaluation of the essay we're looking at. But it's also generic because that exact comment, the way it's written, can be used in just about any essay for likely for the assignment. Whereas your thesis neglects to show your opposition to Baldwin's claim, this second bullet point here, that one would probably be text specific because it's referring to something that is happening within the paper that the respondent is observing. The only possible way it could be generic would be if all the essays for the assignment were referencing what is being talked about here. What are you saying here is generic because you can ask that question just about all the time for an essay. It's also a global revision-oriented clarification attempt. What are you saying about Baldwin here could actually be text-specific, but we notice that there's not a huge difference in the text construction between these two questions. So this is one of the reasons why it's worth looking into generic and text-specific comments, is trying to think about what we're looking for when we say we want specificity among our students and how helpful it actually is to make that attempt. So what I did for this study is I looked at a sample of 20 undergraduates at a Korean university. In this English writing class that the students were in, they completed 2 essays for the class, and each essay required 2 drafts. The students completed peer response following the first draft, and then they were expected to create revisions for the second. For all these students, I found a total of 1,163 marginal comment ideas, not bubbles, which is something that I'll talk about a little bit later, and 284 total comment ideas. Then for revision data, I looked at the second draft and I tried to make a connection between revision requests or ideas and also likely relations to the actual response. In other words, the revision that takes place in the text has to have some possible to strong connection to the idea that was being shared. Now, because of this being a class where students did their work on computers as opposed to oral communication or handwritten communication, it is worth thinking about the circumstances of how this peer response was completed. So essentially, these were all asynchronous annotations done in the browser during class time. Students are basically annotating a document that they're looking at. They're not interacting back and forth with the writer. The writer can download this as they like later and consider what they are looking at for revision purposes. And in this case, there were either 1 or 2 reviewers per document, depending on how the class pairings broke down. And if there were more than 1 reviewer for those cases, those reviewers could not see what other people wrote. So only the writer of the essay and also the teacher of the class can see in that circumstance. So here are the general findings that I'd like to share with you. You'll notice that I have these rows organized in terms of generic items in gray and green items for specific comments. And what you see here, first of all, is that for both of the essays, this is both essays combined, certainly there were more attempts at giving revision-oriented commentary than non-revision oriented commentary, and more global commentary than local commentary. If we look to the right column, the totals for each row here, we do see that there is a greater interest on the parts of students to give generic evaluations, specific clarifications, generic suggestions. The bottom 2 items here for statements, these are items that do not by themselves fall into the other categories. An example of a statement would be giving a reason for an evaluation or suggestion that is not itself an evaluation or a suggestion. It's just providing extra information or context for the writer. So I didn't want to ignore those. I put those into their own category. And as such, these items cannot appear by themselves. They have to be attached to one of the other categories that you see here. You'll probably notice that there are quite a few zeros in these items, and that is typical for the peer response literature. When it comes to non-revision items, we are not frequently seeing examples of non-revision clarifications or suggestions or alterations, though there can be a few examples here and there. Whereas non-revision evaluations would usually fall into a praise or positive kind of category. If we go to the next slide, this shows the summary comment ideas. Again, there were 284 total here, and just to be clear, it was labeled a summary comment if it was its own separate submission of discussing the entire essay, as opposed to targeting any particular part of the essay and sharing that kind of marginal comment. So certainly more evaluations here and some suggestions, as you can see in these two items. This is actually meeting expectations for the most part, because you're trying to give your peer some kind of general idea of what the essay should be and currently is. So it's not going to be very frequent for students to, for example, give generic alterations in the comments. And as that sometimes happens, it might be a reminder of what they already said within the marginal comments, which is another important issue to consider when it comes to how we do coding for all of these ideas in peer response. Okay, let's take a look at table 3 here. This table shows revision practices. Essentially, this is showing the revisions that students did to their essays that have some possible connection to the peer response idea content that they were given. And you'll notice it has the same organization as before as far as generic, specific, and also the type categories, with global and local appearing in the columns in the middle. Certainly the highest number was for generic evaluations, and you see that in comparison to specific evaluations, it was much higher than that. Part of the reason that would be that something about the evaluation could be generic to the point where any change could satisfy what the person is observing. We see the same thing when it comes to generic suggestions versus specific suggestions, a much higher number between the two. So if somebody requests change that, well, that's a generic suggestion, and that could qualify if something was changed. This, again, is something that we need to consider when it comes to the quality of peer response, the quality of coding for these types of ideas. One thing that's noteworthy is that specific clarifications at 49 is actually higher than generic clarifications. And we do have specific statements being higher than generic statements. One thing that's worth noting about this statements category that I created is that, again, these are ideas in isolation, even though one comment bubble might have something like 5 or 6 ideas sometimes, depending on how the student wrote it. So, for example, a generic evaluation can be paired with a specific statement. And that is something that is also a vital concern for how we examine peer response. How are we determining specificity, not just in terms in isolation, but in how all these different ideas work together? There were just a couple of categories that showed up 0 here, but in this case, we were talking about alterations at the global level, which is not a category that's going to have much presence in peer response more often than not. So here are some of the noteworthy trends I'd like to point out that I observed across all of these papers and their response. One thing that I was seeing was a lot of class language. Class language is the idea that students are mimicking or echoing some of the language that they have learned in the class from the instructor, etc. So something like, interesting hook, it grabbed my attention right away, shows some class language because the instructor would have explained that hooks are interesting when they grab your attention. There were a number of generic single ideas. What I mean here is that for an annotation for one comment bubble, there were a number of times where there was only one total idea, and many of those were generic. So something like, this one is good, is a generic evaluation, or are you sure would be a generic clarification. There were different interesting hedging strategies or concessions that students used. Sometimes I think I was seeing things that could show politeness strategies. Like one student wrote, it looks fancy, but, and then they sort of get to the meat of their evaluation and suggestion. Another thing that many students did was some variant of, it would be better, it might be better, I think it will be improved if, and so on. So that was showing up pretty frequently when it comes to putting suggestions together, especially when the students were trying to give a suggestion that was specific, but they had trouble giving the reasons why sometimes. There were a few rhetorical questions here or there that were worth noticing, because those are showing up as clarifications, regardless of generic or specific. But they have something in the way they are constructed that makes one think that they are not quite clarifications, but meant to be hinting at something else, like an evaluation or suggestion. So, did you choose your title was a good example, because this appeared on a paper where there was no title. So, obviously the person is trying to say, get your title on the page. There were a number of vague, generic ideas, and what I'm going to call for this presentation false specificity that I like to discuss that I think needs to be investigated in the future. So when I say vague, generic ideas, I'm talking about ideas that appear like an evaluation or a suggestion, but they don't quite give the writer clear ideas of what to do. So try to write it differently was a good example of this. Again, this was a single idea that I discussed a moment ago, and that kind of comment doesn't really give the reason why or what's the problem with the way the highlighted item is in the first place. When I mean false specificity, I'm talking about comments that are almost generic. And the reason why they are not is because they make a reference to something that appears in the work. So, nice repetition of 5 senses is a possible example of false specificity. The person could have just done nice repetition, stopped right there, and then that's also almost a generic comment. But they make reference to the item that they're highlighting in the text. This does not mean that the students are faking it or anything like that, but it is something that we would want to think about because in the absence of more ideas, more information, we are not quite sure what to make of that text in terms of differentiating it from other category types. Now, in examining this this data sets, I did come across some constraints with my coding that I think not only happens in other instances of peer response, but are worth investigating in the future. So what happens is there are many moments where you can see that there is complexity both within and across comments. So this student says, nice hook, and the connecting is good. Trying to decide how many ideas are existing in just this one sentence, or the fact that this sentence was actually also part of a large comment bubble with more comments on the introduction, is certainly important. There must be some strength that students believe comments draw from each other. We also see this in instances of repetition. So in one paper, for example, the essay writer, according to the peer reader, thought that the writer was criticizing a person too much. So there are 3 or 4 incidences where they make a comment bubble making that claim. And you can see this here. Again, merely criticizing Pak, the again is referring not just to what's in the text, but what the person said in their peer response. So the fact that there is repetition of ideas is something that probably needs to be examined, because they are coded as such for the 4 the dimensions that I've mentioned, but those dimensions can't account for repetition or complexity. There also might be something about tone that needs to be investigated in the future. So this student wrote, "That sounds super racist." And that's pretty easy to code. That is a text-specific, evaluation, revision-oriented, and at a global level. And that is something that, while it can be coded that way, it doesn't really quite show the student's emotion or reaction in a way that differentiates itself from the very first comment I have here, the interesting hook comment. So how students express their tone, their personality or emotion is something that maybe needs to be investigated as well. So this leads me to my final thoughts. I do believe that we can demonstrate specificity as a separate interactive dimension with Lewin Sadler's original framework, and could possibly use that kind of dimension for other coding schemes. But I do think that there needs to be some more investigation on what it means to be text-specific. Because right now I'm adopting the original Ferris definition, and essentially text-specific is not generic. It doesn't explain how it is text-specific in any further detail. So a good example of something to investigate might be text-specific because it refers to an idea in the essay, or text-specific because it refers to an idea from outside the essay, which the peer respondent might think is useful to the writer. That kind of thing. I do think that text-specific dimensions are useful for exposing some of the concerns that we have with peer response designs and research. And I highlight the vague generic ideas and false specific ideas as an example of this. And even with specificity, I do think that more peer response literature would benefit from trying to get to a definition of how ideas are complex. It's the best word I have right now to describe how different ideas interact with each other. When you look at my adaptation of the Lewin Sadler framework, when you look at other people's work, more often than not, they are coding in isolation, but we don't have frequently a good sense of how those ideas draw strength from each other or make different types of connections within or even without the essay in some cases. So that is the end of my presentation. You can see my references here on the left. Peer response is a topic that I'm frequently interested in, trying to finish up my dissertation on a topic just like this. L2 writing, discourse analysis, and digital affordances are frequent topics of mine. So if you think that you are a person who would like to collaborate in the future on these or similar topics, or if you just like to ask any questions of me, you can find my email right here. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Everyone stay healthy and enjoy the conference. Have a good day.